Alan and Sean here from the Prancing Pony Podcast, welcoming you to the Tolkien Experience Podcast.
The Tolkien Experience Podcast is an attempt to bring the fan and scholarly communities together around our shared passion, the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Each episode features a notable scholar or member of the fan community sharing their Tolkien experience.
And now we'll send you over to Sarah and Luke.
Thanks, Alan. I'm Luke Shelton.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Every other week, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guest to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any further delay, let me introduce our guest. Today, I am very excited to interview William Fliss, who I know as Bill Fliss. He is the archivist in Special Collections and University Archives at Marquette University. Some of us actually just call him the Tolkien archivist here at Marquette. He works with Tolkien's works, including The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and a couple other short stories written by Tolkien. The library actually collects all of the manuscript copies that led to these works. And so all of the different rough drafts and things that Tolkien went through are housed at the Marquette University Library. One thing I want to point out in particular, and that we'll talk about in more detail in his interview, is that Bill has started the J.R.R. Tolkien Fandom Oral History Collection. I'll include a link to this project in the show notes, and I really want to encourage listeners to go and participate in this project when possible, because I think it's a great way to kind of catalog where the fandom is right in this moment. So without any further ado, let's dive right into the questions. So Bill, I'll just start from the beginning. How were you introduced to Tolkien's work?
I was introduced to Tolkien's work through and this is, I think, true for many people I found of my generation, through the Rankin Bass animated version of The Hobbit that appeared on television. Although I don't know that I actually was introduced to it through the movie itself. I believe what happened is that one of my older brothers received the boxed album set. It was records, and then there was a booklet that went with it, and you listened to the records and then followed along in the booklet. And I think that was my first real introduction to him. I have this memory. It's almost this fragment vision of being. I'm the youngest of 6, and my oldest siblings are many years older than I am. And so I remember being in the bedroom of 2 of my older brothers. They were both in high school at the time, and one of them was reading The Lord of the Rings because there was an English teacher at the high school who was a fan. And I recall that I think was the first time I ever heard Tolkien's name. And I think that might have preceded even the exposure to the Rankin Bass Hobbit. It was after then I learned about Tolkien through the Rankin Bass production that I then went on to read the works. I actually think I read The Lord of the Rings before I read The Hobbit.
So it was kind of in the ether even before the movies.
Yeah, definitely. And there's something almost embarrassing, I have to admit. I'm reluctant to say publicly, but I think the way it worked was I was introduced to the Rankin Bass Hobbit, and one of my other brothers, oldest brother, got back from the Army. I think this was around 1981 or so, and he had become a reader of fantasy in the Army, and so he brought back some books. And I hate to say it, but before I read The Lord of the Rings, I think the book I read immediately before it was Terry Brooks' The Sword of Shannara, which is one of the most derivative books that's a derivative of Tolkien's work. And I think I read that actually before I read The Lord of the Rings. But once I read The Lord of the Rings, then I realized, what true fantasy was.
So you went from kind of a derivative work of Tolkien into Tolkien himself. And how did that transition go? Did you instantly see like a quality difference, or did it take you a while to adjust to Tolkien?
I think at the time I was only about 11, I think, when I read both of those works. So that was a pretty young age. So Tolkien, I think, was more difficult to get into, but I do remember that I enjoyed it more when I was finished with it than I had the Terry Brooks book.
Hmm. So was that your fondest reading of Tolkien's work, or does another experience of Tolkien stand out to you more?
Well, as I mentioned, I read Lord of the Rings when I was 11. And the following year, when I was 12, I tried to read the Silmarillion, but I abandoned it.
Hmm.
And a couple years later, I tried again. I remember we were on I was on a car vacation trip with my parents, and I was reading it in the car, and I succeeded really in understanding it, I think of it like I cracked the code. I was able to keep
Hmm.
everything straight in my head, and that really unlocked the work for me. And I just absolutely loved reading it at that time. And so that probably stands out as my fondest memory because this was something I had tried and failed. And so to try again and to succeed and then to just feel like I had discovered something amazing was just a real sense of accomplishment. I genuinely loved reading that. And that work, the Silmarillion in particular, was um, just a, a key book for me for many years. I think in high school it was probably my favorite book. I read it many times, and it really provided me with a welcome escape. I mean, high school can be tough for a lot of people, and mine wasn't. My experience wasn't terrible, but still, it was a place I could go to get away from other things and just immerse myself in that world. And I just absolutely loved it.
I probably should have followed that route. uh, I I went straight into it after the Lord of the Rings, and I was, oh gosh, probably 11 or 12 as well. And instead of giving up, I forced myself to finish the whole thing, and did not understand a good half of what was going on.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I mean, uh, Tom Shippey talks about how challenging it can be for readers because it's so unlike a modern novel or book in the sense that in modern fiction, if you take a creative writing workshop, you're taught that your characters change in the story. I mean, your main character is usually different at the end of the story than he or she was at the beginning. And
Hmm.
in the Silmarillion, the characters don't really change. They enter the story a certain way with certain alignment, certain qualities, and they exit the story generally the same way. And the drama and the power of the story lies in the relationships among the characters, the network of relationships of genealogical relationships and relationships based on oaths that have been sworn and such. And once you're able to kind of keep all those relationships uh, in play in your mind, then you can unlock the drama and the power of the narrative.
Hmm. Hmm. So, speaking of the Silmarillion, is your favorite part of Tolkien's work from the Silmarillion?
Well, I don't know that I have a favorite part of Tolkien's work. When I was thinking about that question, I think I was in when I was thinking of favorite part of it, I was thinking more what's resonated with me the most about his writing.
Hmm.
I think has been his ability to create a very rich and powerful history for a secondary world. And I think
Hmm.
that's most evident in The Lord of the Rings. And so that's probably my favorite part of his work. If you look at his whole listing of the things he published or worked on, because I think it all comes together so beautifully in The Lord of the Rings, where he's able to build this incredible sense of history lying behind the events of the story, and the character at various moments, or not the character, the reader at various moments uh, glimpses and comes into contact with that. And for me, that was very powerful.
Hmm.
So I think that's probably the favorite parts of his work are where that happens. Um, for example, when they're in the mines of Moria and Gimli sings that song and he mentions Gondolin and Nargothrond. And, if you've read the Silmarillion and are aware of that backstory, it really opens up that scene for the reader. And then when you think that, Gandalf is bearing Glamdring, which was Turgon's sword, or that Aragorn wears the Ring of Barahir, which has passed through so many generations from the ring, the hand of Felagund to his hand, in Felagund being the king of Nargothrond, that sense of the continuous history and scope of it, it just bowls me over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one thing that really draws a lot of us in, I think, is just because the trick is once you read one book, you're kind of hooked and you have to figure out what all the allusions are within the world to the other stories, right? So you have to go
Yes.
read more.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, one thing does lead to another, definitely. I think it's a natural jumping off point for people that have enjoyed the Silmarillion to then dive into history of Middle Earth. I think it's just a natural progression.
hmm So, as you have grown, has your approach to Tolkien changed over time?
Yeah, I think so. I think it does for a lot of people. I think someone for whom it would never change, I would almost think that they would read it maybe once, enjoy it, and then never ever come back to it.
hmm
But if you revisit it, I think the approach almost always changes, I would think. I mean, when I was 11 and I first approached it, I really approached it as an adventure story, a very primitive level. I think I was viewing it and I enjoyed it. But then I think as I grew up and got into adolescence, this historical consciousness that was rising in me, that is something I really connected with. And that shaped my approach to his work quite a bit. In high school, I was really into the Middle Earth role-playing game, which was published by Iron Crown Enterprises, or ICE, the gaming company, in the 80s. I think they stopped producing the game in 1999 because they lost the license to be able to put out the materials. But I was really into that, and so my approach to Tolkien changed in that the two things complemented each other, but in a way that the reading of Tolkien almost was a supporting role to the game, in the sense that I studied and read Tolkien in order to help me with things related to the game. So, for example, designing adventures, creating backstories for characters, trying to understand the motivations of NPCs or non-player characters within the game. So it was kind of a strange secondary role that it played because the game was so important to me for a while. But I think then after that, after my phase with MERP ended, Middle Earth role playing, I returned to the stories more just for the sheer enjoyment of them. And again, the historical aspect of it resonated probably with me the most. After I became the Tolkien archivist at Marquette in 2012, the approach changed as well. That role at Marquette is something that I didn't seek out, and it's not like I was hired to do it. It's more a situation where the person that was doing it left. And so in the interim, I filled that role, and then the role became permanent. I had the advantage of knowing the stories well, with a history of reading and enjoying the works. I had a good grasp of the legendarium, but the approach has really had to change since I've gotten that job. It's become much more academic in a sense. I've had to learn at least the basics of the literature surrounding Tolkien, so that I can better help researchers and people who come to use Marquette's collection. And then also I've had an opportunity to do some teaching of Tolkien at Marquette through the honors program with some small freshman seminars, where I have just about a dozen students, and we read The Lord of the Rings, just meeting like almost like a book club, but they get a credit of credit for it. And so I've had, that's kind of changed how I approached him. I've had to approach him as an instructor, kind of looking to read and then form questions and lead discussion. But also working with the collection at Marquette, my approach has changed. It's very much focused on kind of the the story behind the story of how he wrote The Lord of the Rings in particular.
Mm-hmm.
So working with the manuscripts and trying to understand the manuscript collection and how it all fits together, that's led me to approach him in a much different way, where it's not so much just the story, the published story itself, but it's the different versions that went into the published story and understanding the progression of those and how those fit together. Again, with the hope or the idea that this helps me to guide and assist researchers who are wanting to dive into those manuscripts. So it's changed quite a bit. I still do enjoy, approach it just as a personal reading. I find that that's changed as well. The historical emphasis has remained strong for me, but one thing that I know that that didn't resonate with me early on, but has now, is the secondary world. Not in the sense necessarily of its history, because I think I tended to be much more interested in the geopolitical side of things and how different characters fit together. But the lens through which I enjoy it now more is the secondary world, as a place, as it's almost its own character in the story. So the descriptions of Middle Earth and the various places within it, those are sections of the story which years ago, honestly, I would have passed over relatively quickly. But now, for me, they're some of the most moving and enjoyable moments in the story. Just almost savoring the way that he describes this place. For example, when Gimli is talking about the glittering caves, or when Frodo and Sam reach Ithilien, right after having been at the Morannon, when they enter Ithilien, and just the incredible description he gives of the flora and topography of Ithilien. Those are the moments that resonate with me more now than they would have years ago.
Mm-hmm. I know that as the archivist, the Tolkien archivist at Marquette, you also deal a lot with fan reception and fanzines, and a lot to do with kind of the fan culture around Tolkien. And I'm curious, has any of that material kind of bled into your own reading of The Lord of the Rings, or inspired or influenced you in any way?
Not that I can think of specifically. I can't really think of any exact instances where it has. The two are not entirely separate. They do, I think, complement each other. At least in my workday, they tend to complement each other.
Mm-hmm.
The fanzines, which really have been the heart of our fan holdings, and these are fan magazines that were published historically about Tolkien, beginning you see the first articles in the late 50s, but I think generally around 1960 is considered, with I Palantir, that fanzine is kind of considered the start of the Tolkien, of the fanzines devoted entirely to Tolkien. Reading those, some of the articles and pieces in those are really quite good. The early readers were very perceptive in their reading of Tolkien. So glancing through those and reading through those, I can't point to any specific insights that have shaped my own reading of the story, but there's some great insights contained in those fanzines.
Mm-hmm.
The fan materials that we collect at Marquette, that kind of started after we got the manuscripts. The interest in fandom was something that developed organically out of us possessing the manuscripts. We began to attract books and theses and dissertations about Tolkien, and we came into contact with people who had excellent collections of fanzine materials, and so we sort of built that out, and we've continued since. And I've now been trying to find new ways to try to document fandom, since it's still going strong, definitely.
Mm-hmm. So the last question I usually have for my text-based project is, would you ever recommend Tolkien's work and why or why not?
Well, I have only recommended Tolkien personally to one person, and that was my niece, who's also my goddaughter. And I gave her an illustrated copy of The Hobbit when she was very young, and she read it. And I think I might have done it because I sensed she would like it. Her parents were both really lovers of Tolkien. And so, and it worked. She loved it, and that copy of The Hobbit is a prized possession to her to this day. And now she's over 30 now. I would say that beyond that, I really haven't recommended him personally to anybody. I do come into contact with many visitors to Marquette, including school groups who visit to learn more about Tolkien. I will recommend him to people in those classes. For example, if it's, say, a 6th grade class that's reading The Hobbit and comes to Marquette to see some of the Hobbit manuscripts, I may mention, well, if you really like The Hobbit, I recommend you try the Lord of the Rings. Or if I'm doing, say it's a college class that's reading the Lord of the Rings and they visit, I will encourage them, if you really enjoyed the Lord of the Rings, you might want to give the Silmarillion a try, because it really provides so much depth and such a new way to look at many of the scenes within the Lord of the Rings. So I'll do recommendations like that, but I am hesitant to recommend it to someone if I don't know them pretty well to think that it might resonate with them. Part of that might be is that I'm definitely aware that Tolkien is not everybody's author. There are people for whom he leaves them completely cold. For example, my older siblings, to varying degrees, I think have all enjoyed Tolkien, but our parents, neither of them, he was not their author. They had no interest whatsoever in him. So I've always been aware that there are people that he's just not going to resonate with them. And so I'm a little hesitant to recommend it without a lot of consideration.
Yeah. Even in my own experience, it really depends on not just the author, but the specific book that you find by that author and the specific time that you are in your life are you at the right place to interact with that book,
Very much. Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. Yeah, I can definitely see that.
So it sounds like you kind of had, just to ask a bit of a follow-up question here, it sounds like you kind of had a circuitous route to becoming the Tolkien archivist and then kind of dealing with fan material, but you have very quickly gotten into the deep end with collecting fan responses to the work and experiences about the work, kind of similar to this. Would you mind telling us about the oral history, the fandom oral history project that you have going on?
Sure. Yeah. I'd love to mention it. It's an idea that came to me a few years ago now. I think in 2017, I had been thinking about the collection and about our fan materials, and the fanzine collection at Marquette is unparalleled. But there really wasn't much that we had on fandom since really 2000. And so I was trying to brainstorm or think of ways to try to document fandom. So much of it has gone online, and there are ways to harvest and capture websites and content online. But I was trying to think of other ways to do that. And I was sitting in an archives conference session on podcasting for archives. And the idea occurred to me that I could try to use recorded technology in order to capture fan experiences. I think that realization was driven by some experiences I had at Marquette, where we would have visitors. We still do. We have visitors just pop in unannounced to the archives, usually because they're passing through town. And most of these people are almost like pilgrims who are stopping at Marquette to somehow make a connection with the manuscripts that we have. The manuscripts being the original papers that Tolkien produced when he was writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And also we have Farmer Giles of Ham and Mr. Bliss, two lesser known works. And so people stop by when they're passing through Milwaukee. They stop in to see the manuscripts or to connect with them somehow. And this oftentimes leads to little conversations that I'll have with them. If I'm available, the desk might call me out and I'll come out and chat for a few minutes. And I was very impressed with the conversations we would have, the fascinating stories and anecdotes that these visiting fans would share. And some of these people were coming from quite a ways off. It would not, I was not surprised if it was, say, a couple fans from the Netherlands that were just suddenly there on a Friday afternoon in the reading room. It wouldn't shock me at all. And so hearing these stories, I began to think, well, these are the sorts of things that we should be capturing if we want to capture the fandom in a new way, other than just the fanzine material we've been collecting.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really the start of this collection, which is basically an archive of individual fan testimonials about their experiences and their relationship with Tolkien. I decided at the outset, I set some boundaries. I decided to keep them short. So I limit each fan to 3 minutes to share what they would like. And I do pose 3 very general questions to get the fans thinking, although how they respond to them within those 3 minutes is entirely up to them.
Mm-hmm.
But the questions are, the first one's similar to the one you ask. I'll ask them, when did you first encounter the works of Tolkien, which gives people a chance to share a little bit of their story. And then I'm also interested in why they're a fan and what Tolkien has meant to them. And it's amazing the different ways people can interpret that. So 3 minutes to address those 3 questions. One of the reasons I chose 3 minutes is that I figured I could then collect a lot of these interviews, because I knew I wanted to present them in some way that people could listen to them and read them if they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so from the outset, I had this idea of setting up a website where the actual audio recording could be listened to like a podcast, or the transcript could be read and even searched across. So right now, I think there are 360 interviews in the collection that's online, but the visitor can keyword search across all of the interviews. So if they're interested, who's talking about Galadriel, they can type in Galadriel and they'll get all of the interviews where she's mentioned in some form. But keeping them short, one other reason I kept them short is I developed this idea that what I would do is I would shoot for a big number. And I decided my goal would be 6,000 interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And I made this choice with my heart and not with my head, honestly. So the idea came from the fact that in The Lord of the Rings, Theoden, the King of Rohan, leads 6,000 riders to raise the siege of Minas Tirith. And so I thought, well, I'll create a host of fans where there's one fan for each of those riders in the story, which if you do the math, it's like ultimately would be at 3 minutes per interview is like 300 hours of fan testimonial. What I've quickly found, though, is that this is going to take me a long time to do. So that's why I say I made the decision with my heart and not with my head. I think had I been thinking it through more, I might have been reluctant, since it will take a while to reach that goal. But I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this, because I would certainly invite any of your listeners who might like to contribute an interview to please contact me. I have a scheduling page through our website where people can select scheduled slots to do their interview over using Zoom over the internet.
Mm-hmm.
Or alternatively, they could just email me and we can figure out a time that's convenient and do the interview. It only takes a few minutes to do. If people are coming from a another country and they're more comfortable giving their interview in their native language, they're welcome to do that as well. I'll capture it, and I've managed to collect a number of interviews from countries outside the United States, and many of them have offered to help me by doing the translations. So that's a possibility as well. But the more interviews, the better from my perspective. So I would invite everybody, if they're interested, to contribute.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to give links to that page in all of our show notes wherever we post the podcast. So hopefully it'll be really easy for listeners to follow through on. I will give my personal testimony that I recently sat down and recorded that with you, and it was a low stress situation. Did it from my desk at home, so that was nice. It only took a few minutes. I think we were, all of the beforehand chat to make sure everything was all set up, and recording and saying goodbye only took less than 15 minutes, I think. So, it was a painless and fun activity. So highly recommended. And going back to your conversation about how long it's going to take you, well, that's just job security, right?
That's one way to look at it. Yeah, it's going to turn into a longitudinal study. It'll be, of course, over many years, which may not be a bad thing, because there's the Amazon show that's coming out in the next couple of years. It'll be interesting to see if there's if that generates a new body of fans, and if those fans move into the books, and what their story is, and so I'll be here capturing all that, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you so much for spending the time to talk with me. It was great to hear about your Tolkien experience, and I'm so excited. Hopefully several listeners will go over and participate in the Oral History Project.
Thank you very much, Luke. I really enjoyed talking with you.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We have a lot of fun making these podcasts.
So much fun. It's always exciting to talk to fans and scholars about their Tolkien experience.
If you want to know more about the ways to connect with this episode's guest that they mentioned in this interview, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. Also, don't forget to follow the podcast on your favourite social media sites.
That's right. We're on Facebook as Tolkien Experience, and also on Twitter as @TolkienEXP. So don't forget to like, follow, share, and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking with our guests. You can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I am @LukeB.Shelton.
You can also look for me on Twitter, where I am @AaronLPalmadill. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. We truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.